Hi, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar, Talking Justice, Values-Based Messaging for Community Legal Centres. My name is Penny Sullivan. I'm one of the Sector Sustainability Coordinators at Community Legal Centres Queensland. First, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are holding today's webinar. In Meanjin, Brisbane, they are the Turrbal and the Yagara people. We pay deepest respect to elders past, present and emerging. As this webinar is being viewed by people across Queensland and Australia, we also pay respect to the traditional owners throughout the country. We recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the traditional custodians of the lands in Australia and their continuing connection to land, water and culture. We acknowledge the stories, traditions and living cultures of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and commit to fostering a culture of learning from and working with First Nations peoples in the spirit of reconciliation and access to justice. We extend a very warm welcome to any First Nations peoples joining us today. I'm very pleased to now welcome Stella Maynard, the Research and Communications Manager at Community Legal Centres New South Wales, to provide some training for us on the new CLC's New South Wales Talking Justice Guide. Stella's going to cover best practice guidance and recommendations in using language that reflects our values, boosts understanding of CLCs and builds public support for social and progressive change. I'll let Stella share a bit more about themselves when I hand over in a moment. Before I do that though, just some quick housekeeping. Today's webinar is being recorded and we'll have the recording available to download in the next couple of days. A link for the PowerPoints and the Talking Justice resource has been emailed out to everyone who registered and can also be downloaded from our website. And these resources are available from the handout section in your GoToWebinar control panel. We do encourage you to ask questions. Please type your question into the question box on the control panel and we'll read your questions out. We will hold questions until the end of the presentation, but do feel free to type them in as you think of them. So I'm going to hand over now to Stella and talk to you again at the end of the session. Thanks so much, Stella. Stella, you'll just need to come off mute.
Thank you, Penny, and hello everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Is that all good?
Now it's all good? Yep, got you.
Okay, awesome. Cool. Sorry, I think there's a bit of a delay on the line. But hello, I am Stella. As Penny mentioned, I'm the Research and Communications Manager at Community Legal Centres New South Wales. So kind of like CLCQ, we are the peak body for 42 community legal centres across the state. Very excited to be here to present to you all today about Talking Justice. It's actually my last day at CLC New South Wales, so get in any questions while you can while I'm here. I'll pop my email in the chat at the end. Yeah, and feel free to ask questions in the chat. I think it'll just be easiest if I return to them at the end. Just for flow's sake. All right, I'm going to get into it. So I want to start by acknowledging that I am calling from sovereign Gadigal land, and I want to acknowledge Gadigal people as the sovereign owners of this country that I'm calling from. Sovereignty was never ceded, and I think it's really important to really think about what we mean when we acknowledge country, and we're talking about language and the values that we reflect through language, because Aboriginal people have been subject to persistent racist propaganda since colonisation, and language has been used to justify and naturalise colonisation. And as people in the legal profession, obviously the law is one place where language really coalesces as a form of power. So I just want to hold for us to hold that in mind throughout this presentation, that language is deeply political and tied to the exercise of colonial power on this continent. So this is Talking Justice. This is the front cover. You can download it from our website, that link on this slide. I believe there's also a PDF that's been emailed to you all, and you can also download it from the handout section of this webinar. So today I'm basically going to be going over giving you a bit of context and background. I'm going to cover the key recommendations and then point you to some further resources. The guide is about 50 pages, so it covers more than I can go into in this presentation. So I do sort of encourage you, if you're interested in language and learning about this, to get in there and dive a bit deeper. All right, so Talking Justice provides guidance on how to use language that is not only respectful and humanising towards the people that community legal centres support, but also language that reflects our values, that boosts understanding of community legal centres and builds public support for the policy and law reform issues that we care about. So I've developed this guide to provide guidance on how to speak about the communities that we work with, about community legal centres work, and about the social issues that we care about. Why do this? Lots of reasons. There are 42 community legal centres in New South Wales. There are over 180 centres nationally. It strengthens the power of the sector if we speak as a movement rather than as siloed organisations. So we're stronger together. But one sort of shared experience at community legal centres is totally stretched resources, and crafting stories takes time. And so I kind of wanted to create a bit of a shortcut guide, and bring together some best practice recommendations to help community legal centres, continue developing a sort of strong collective and cohesive voice, and to find, persuasive ways to champion social justice collectively. Language is very political, as I said in my acknowledgement. We can unintentionally or intentionally use language that's stigmatizing or harmful or disempowers and excludes the people we work with, which I think we can all agree we don't want to do that. And as I mentioned, crafting stories takes time. So I'm just, basically this guide is a bit of a shortcut to using language in ways that are alive and precise and easier to connect with. So who has this been developed for? Basically everyone, for volunteers, for lawyers, for social workers, intake workers, directors, law reformers, Aboriginal legal access workers. It's for everyone. It's not just for communicators, and seeing by the number of people who are online, I think you all already know that. From like the perspective of delivering services, like using humanizing and accessible languages is really important when it comes to working in client-centered, community-centered, and informed manner. So I'm hoping that like the recommendations in this guide are relevant across all of your work. So I'm going to jump into the framework that I drew upon. So it's called a values-based communications framework, which was developed by someone called Anna Osorio. So I'm really drawing upon their body of research and literature. A key sort of underpinning of values-based communications is the idea that, like, most people are able to think about issues from multiple and often conflicting perspectives, and I'll give you an example of that in a second. But basically the common cause approach suggests that the language that we use, the messages that we employ, and the way in which we frame issues can have a pretty significant impact on whether someone can be persuaded to care about or take action on social and environmental issues. So facts and evidence are really, really important, but it's the context or the narrative in which those facts and evidence are placed that's really important. As I mentioned, we're not reinventing the wheel, drawing on like a large body of existing messaging guides and messaging research, many of which have been developed by people in the community legal centre sector, like shout out to Human Rights Legal Centre and a bunch of First Nations workers who were part of the Passing the Message stick guide. I've got on the website page that I linked in the first slide at Community Legal Centres New South Wales' website. You can check out a bunch of resources on particular sort of subject areas. And I've also included that at the end of the Talking Justice guide. What is framing? Framing is basically the way an issue is posed or worded. So we talk about massage rather than something literal like stranger pouring your bare skin. This is one that, you know, we might all be familiar with at the moment. Like corporates pour a lot of money into constructing positive associations through the way that they frame fossil fuels. So, you know, for example, mining companies look for lovely ways of talking about environmental devastation. So instead of, you know, talking about ripping up country, or, you know, we hear things like mineral exploration or natural gas instead of methane. So research shows that the terms used to communicate about fossil fuels can have like really dramatically different effects, leading people to either support or oppose like the use of fossil fuels based on what language or framings were used. So that's why it's important. So values-based messaging gives us a way of, you know, sticking to our values and using language that reflects them. And a quick disclaimer, you would already know this, it's a guide, this isn't a rule book. I'm not trying to tell you what to say or how to say it, and indeed a lot of you in this room would know a lot more than I do. So, you know, in some forums, especially like if you're at a parliamentary hearing or you're doing a budget submission, for example, much more technical and specialist language is going to be more appropriate. I guess at the end of the day, what I'm trying to say is that the narrative or the story still remains important. Okay, I'm going to jump into the recommendations. And recommendation 1 is to replace deficit language with strengths-based stories. So firstly, what's deficit language? Well, it's one of the strongest reoccurring themes in the language that community legal centres use, or at least are encouraged to use by government. So this includes terms like vulnerable, disadvantaged, at risk, disenfranchised, disempowered, phrases like most incarcerated, more susceptible to, low knowledge of rights, voiceless, helpless, unskilled, so on and so forth. Why retire deficit language? Firstly, it can reinforce stigma, it can create shame, perpetuate stereotypes, and importantly, I think it obscures the cause of harm or vulnerability that is inflicted by other people, governments, or institutions. So what deficit language does is individualises structural problems and obscures the cause of that harm or vulnerability. So my kind of message here is that there's actually no such thing as a vulnerable or disadvantaged person or place or population. Vulnerability and disadvantage aren't intrinsic qualities that we're born with, they are made. Vulnerability and disadvantage are made through laws, through decisions, through policies, and through actions. And so here, it's about speaking about those forces that create vulnerability. So as People with Disability Australia say, the word vulnerable should be used with care. It comes from the Latin word for wound and can suggest that people with disability are frail and in need of protection. We aren't inherently vulnerable because of our disability, but rather because of the acts and or omissions of the society in which we live. For example, government spending cuts that might result in us being imprisoned in our own homes with minimum support. So instead, I would like to encourage people to embrace strengths-based language and frames. This is language that uses words that respect and acknowledge an individual as a whole person. It allows us to honour the complexity of people's lives, their expertise and their knowledge. I guess like one of the main things about deficit language is, you know, for example, on your community legal centre's website, if you're saying, you know, we help vulnerable and disadvantaged people in X suburb, in order to access your service, you're asking people to identify as vulnerable or disadvantaged. And people have really different understandings of what that means. And so I would suggest using more neutral terms. Like if what you're saying is, you know, people on low or no incomes, maybe that's more appropriate framing, rather than saying financially disadvantaged. And using strengths-based messaging is particularly important if you're not speaking from a position of lived experience. So this does not mean that we paint the world through like rose-coloured glasses and that we ignore the truth. And we still need to speak about all those, you know, forces and barriers and discrimination and colonisation and inequality that people experience. And in the next section, I'm going to move to how we do that. So in the guide, I've got some examples of, you know, making that switch from deficit framing to strengths-based framing. And I've got that in each section of, like, yeah, no need to sort of take notes in this slide. It's all in the handout. Yeah, and like, as you can see, it's all about acknowledging people's expertise, their knowledge, their desires, what they're looking for when they come to you know, access your service, for example. And here's an example that I really like from the Pacific Climate Warriors campaign, who say, "We're not drowning, we're fighting." All right, this is the other kind of easiest way to overcome deficit language, and that is just to use the people do things rule. In other words, if you're describing you know, an inequality or a barrier to justice, name the source of that problem as specifically as possible. So, you know, that might mean naming a specific person or a government, a force or a decision maker. And this also gives, like, our audiences or the people who we want to, you know, hear our messages or connect. This, like, helps give them a clear understanding that, you know, change is possible. All of a sudden, you've given people a clear path for action, you know, and for change. So there's this fantastic report published last year called "Passing the Message Stick," which is on First Nations justice. I really encourage people to check it out. But as they say, our messages need to stop shining the gaze on our wounded bodies and instead shine the gaze on the bullets fired at us and the bullets firing them. Again, you know, Macca's corporates are good at this, which I'm not saying we should act more like Macca's, but it's, I'm loving it for a reason. It's not, it is being loved by me. So easy way to, you know, use the people do things rule is to write or speak in active voice rather than passive voice. So using active voice means simply like assigning an actor and a cause to the problems you describe. So, you know, showing a subject or a person or a government or a thing that acts. Passive voice, on the other hand, centers the person who's being acted upon. So, you know, if you're unsure how to do this, some simple things to ask yourself is, like, who caused this problem? What are they doing and why are they doing it? You know, for example, like an employment law service, instead of talking about the injured builder, we might bring all of these other things into the frame, like maybe there was a colleague who intentionally pushed someone, or, you know, poor work health and safety practices by the boss, or, you know, maybe it was about a government who had introduced legislation that eroded workers' rights. It's about understanding all of this as part of the picture. We might, you know, here are some examples in the red of deficit framing, and in the green of using the people do things rule. So instead of saying Aboriginal children are more than 12 times as likely to be removed from their family than non-Indigenous children, you could say the New South Wales government removes Aboriginal children from their family at more than 12 times the rate of non-Indigenous children. I think it's a lot harder in that second version to place blame on the families, and a lot easier to place the target where we actually want it to be, which is the government's, you know, racist practices. Okay, recommendation 3 is to tell our story and to never negate. And I think, like, community legal centres are really good at this. We don't often slip into negation. Like at times we do, but basically negation is where we want to dispel a myth or challenge a damaging stereotype. It can mean that we end up like reinforcing harmful narratives. So an example of it would be saying, closing youth prisons will not make our communities more dangerous. Negations are words like no or not or never. And the issue with negation is that it can reinforce harmful narratives or remind people of incorrect chains of association. So the refugee rights sector has done like a lot of work to move from a negating frame, which is seeking asylum is not a crime, to I guess more of a they've reclaimed the power of that narrative and have instead said seeking asylum is a human right. The only reason why they had to say that seeking asylum is not a crime is because there was, you know, a very like xenophobic, protectionist sort of right-wing narrative out there that conflated, you know, seeking asylum with criminality. And instead they reclaimed the power of the narrative and spoke from a place of truth. People also, you know, say, if I tell you don't think of an elephant, don't think of an elephant, do not think of an elephant, and then I ask you what you're thinking about, it's likely that at some stage an elephant has popped into your head. And I guess that's a way of sort of reminding you that through negation, you can actually be implicitly reinforcing harmful chains of association. So I think I've kind of spoken about these examples. Okay, recommendation 4 is to be reader friendly and use plain language. Again, I think community legal centres are the experts in this, and I think sometimes the challenge is like, you know, when we're working with external partners, maybe they understand this less often, but I think, you know, there's already incredible work being done across the community legal centre on this front. And this is about, you know, speaking in ways that connect with people and grounding stories in real world experience. So this is basically like a list of pet peeves that I'm going to run through. Number 1 is acronyms or contractions. So instead of saying I work at CLC New South Wales, and there'd probably be 50 people in this room who don't know what that is, I said I work at Community Legal Centres New South Wales, and that's because I didn't want to exclude people, but also because like our values are in our names, and so we should use them in their full, you know, expression as much as possible. Jargon and legalese and bureaucratic terms and specialist language obviously excludes some people who aren't in the know. We want to be embracing more lucid language that is alive and precise and expresses complex ideas in ways that can be understood by people outside the sector. Hedging language is pretty common. That's things like we are committed to providing, or we seek to, or we aim to. Instead, using assertive language, you know, is much clearer and more confident. It also bolsters like our credibility if we're able to just, you know, confidently say we do, we are, we create. Yeah. One point about hedging is obviously sometimes it's legally necessary. For example, you know, use of the term alleged. Oh, this is just an example from, this used to be our induction kit. And there were, I think, 7 or 8 pages of common acronyms used in the community legal sector, which is really helpful. But I think if people could not be using acronyms in the first place, we wouldn't need to be, you know, creating guides, yeah, like this. Using more personal and direct language instead of, you know, impersonal and indirect language. And then, you know, utilising lists and visuals, headings, and a logical structure. All right, move on to recommendation 5. So this is about telling compelling stories of change. And one thing that people sometimes say is to talk about the cake, not the recipe. And what I mean by that is that when you open a cookbook, it's likely going to be the images of the cakes rather than the written explanation of the baking process that makes you want to cook that cake. So the cake is the outcome, and it's very unlikely that you can use like a printed image to convey what your centre does for people or a policy and law reform issue. But we still can talk about those outcomes and describe the future or transformational change that we want. So as the Raise the Rate for Good guide, which is fighting to increase the rate of job seeker and social security payments, as they say, rather than drilling down into the detail of exactly how the income support system needs to be fixed, which is the recipe to get the outcome we need, we talk about what it would mean for people to have enough income to cover the basics, e.g. the cake, which is the outcome of winning the campaign. So obviously these are going to vary depending on the situation, but I'm talking about helping families to stay connected, helping people to find stable housing, people's debt being paid off, someone gaining independence or financial stability, keeping kids with their community or with their mum or their dad. Community legal centres help people to access and to receive quality healthcare and education. And all of these real world examples are much more compelling than speaking purely about the legal process that made them possible. Recommendation 6 is to tell human stories. So we want to be telling human stories as much as is possible. That's because stories give texture and life to the structural and bring, the issues or things that we want to talk about that we care about to life. They can also be a really powerful way for people affected by injustice to speak on their own terms. Facts, as I said at the beginning of this presentation, facts and evidence and legal analysis are really important. But if your message is sort of becoming a list of statistics, that can be really dry and difficult to connect with. So it's important that they're part of our communications, but not the whole picture. Instead, what we want to do is foreground the lived experience, expertise, and the voices of people affected by injustice in our work, and then support those stories with a base of sound evidence. So Rachel Ball, who used to work at the Human Rights Law Centre, has created a really fantastic guide a couple of years ago called When I Tell My Story, I'm in Charge, Ethical and Effective Storytelling in Advocacy. And that's a toolkit specifically for community legal centres who are sort of grappling with the difficulty of balancing like that need to tell human stories with the legal and ethical requirements of our work. So in Talking Justice, I worked with the Principal Solicitors Network, the conveners of the Principal Solicitors Network, to come up with like a checklist of questions and considerations, both ethical and legal, that I think will help you to step through those possible risks and difficulties. So the key principles include consent, participation and self-determination, collaboration, and really importantly, situating stories in the context of broader campaigns. So again, that's positioning the individual within the structural. And this can take, a bunch of different forms, whether that's someone giving direct testimony, it could be de-identified case studies, or more of like a community-led storytelling project that your centre supports and resources. As Rachel Ball says, Informed consent means that people should be aware of why and how their stories will be told, and of the foreseeable risks and benefits, including outcomes that are not likely. Freely given consent can be more difficult to determine, as a client's sense of obligation or gratitude for receiving a free legal service may also muddy the quality of consent. So that process of ensuring that someone's giving, fully informed and freely given consent is going to differ depending on the context. But, some key risks that I'd encourage you to consider is potential harm to people or their families or their communities, the possibility that focusing on one story could exclude other voices and perspectives, the risk that lawyers and other professional advocates disempower communities by seeking to control the way their stories are told or what language they use, and certain, legal and professional risks and obligations, that would include obvious things like confidentiality, legal professional privilege, and defamation. So there are a bunch of ways that we can minimise those risks and, maximise the sort of benefits of storytelling. That includes, like, obviously having, pretty clear mechanisms for obtaining consent. Working with community groups and networks can circumvent issues that might arise in the context of a lawyer-client relationship. So by that I mean, maybe linking someone up with another group that you're working on a campaign with and saying, hey, we can't work on this particular story because, you're a client, but here's someone else that you could work with. And also doing storytelling as part of a broader campaign. All right, recommendation 7 is to lead with values and visions. And this is a really important one that is quite easy to forget because it kind of involves a little bit of a rewiring. I've found personally that it's involved a bit of a rewiring for myself. So this is about telling stories that activate collective and community strength rather than individualistic or protective thinking. Values-based messaging primes. Sorry, this is going to be a bit strange, but it's going to become more obvious. Values-based messaging primes or prepares our audience or our listener or reader with values that are helpful for our cause, and then suppresses unhelpful ones. So what we want to do is prime what's called intrinsic values, which are values that are inherently rewarding. And you can also understand intrinsic values to be, that sort of cluster of values that might loosely make up what you imagine to be when you think about social justice. And this is important because the stories we tell, whether we're aware of it or not, are underpinned by our values. And when we communicate, we should be really clear about what values we're wanting to get across. These can also help, doing a sort of value-led framing can also help us to make sure that we are demonstrating alternatives and ideas we have for a better world, not just kind of being on the attack. They can bring people together over shared or common ground. They can make our messages stronger and more persuasive, and they can compel people to act. So this is what I mean when I speak about intrinsic values. And yes, these are kind of slightly airy-fairy, but if you think about these, they're really like motivating forces. That, it might be about, you might wake up in the morning and choose to work at a community legal centre rather than a corporate law firm, because you like fostering a sense of connection and belonging where you live. Maybe it's about ensuring everyone has what they need to live well, that everyone is both cared for and cared about. Collaboration is about working together and building strength and human connection and solidarity and collective struggle. Fairness, obviously, free from discrimination and prejudice. and diversity, you know, finding strength in difference and embracing difference, so on and so forth. So these are some intrinsic values that we want to be, I guess, spotlighting in our work. And these are extrinsic values that we want to be suppressing or avoiding. So these are values that are centered on external approval or awards. And it can be like very tempting and understandable to tailor communications to appeal to, you know, the dominant values or motivations of different groups of people. So, you know, some examples of extrinsic values are, you know, self-reliance, sort of bootstraps narratives, the wealth ones, which we can sometimes slip into when we speak about value for money, or sort of cost-benefit analyses, national security, which is one that I've really never heard in the sector, or order, which we can sometimes slip into when we're, you know, speaking about security and safety from a sort of statistical crime perspective. But I guess what I'm here to say today is that community legal centres are valuable because we provide free legal help to people on no or low incomes or people in need, because we're independent and connected to communities, and because we advocate for a fairer society. We're not, you know, valuable because we provide value for money or cheap legal services, and I mean cheap for the government. Those arguments, although they may be true, they're quite compromised and flimsy. They don't centre our truth. And but, you know, as I said, it's obviously very understandable that in the kind of political climate that we have, where funding is stretched and people are grasping for resources, it's obviously very tempting to, you know, slip into especially that wealth framing. As Lily Spencer at Australian Progress says, where something is the right thing to do, we demonstrate that by showing how it helps people or the planet. A better economy is not our end goal. We want a better society, a healthier planet, a better life. And so this affects the way that we talk about our work, or the way that we encourage other people to talk about our work. Sometimes, I know a parliamentarian got up in New South Wales Parliament last year and said this first sentence: community legal centres run on the smell of an oily rag. And it was before I'd done all the research for this report, and I was like, that's great, that's an awesome thing to say. And then I was like, actually, like, that's kind of a bad association, and that's not why community legal centres are important. So I think, you know, one of the kind of main ways to check if your messages are you know, in a values-based framing is to firstly do that mapping, like actually think about what are the values underpinning this, and then take a step back and look at, you know, the sentence or the idea or the campaign and just think, does that stand the test of time? Like, if external things change, like a new government got into power who just wanted to throw money at the community sector, would we still want that sentence to be true? So it's about, I guess, yeah, it's about coming back to the sort of root of who we are and what we stand for. This is a way of structuring values-based messages. So what you do is start with a value, a shared value. I guess it's kind of like a common sense statement to hook your audience. I'll give you an example on the next slide. Then you want to introduce a barrier, a problem, or a conflict, which could be framed as like a threat to the values or the vision. You can use statistics and personal stories at this stage, and, you know, be as specific as possible when establishing the cause of the problem. You know, what are they doing, as well as who's responsible for fixing it or taking action. Then demonstrate solutions, practical ideas or a barrier overcome. So that's, sharing your clear idea, ask or solution for overcoming the barrier. This is also like a moment to demonstrate community strength and power and capability, and really make sure the solution addresses that problem. And then finally, this is the the recipe moment. What's the vision? What's the clear story? What's the outcome that you want? You could also take that final moment to ask people to take action, or for a case study, you could tell the story of how someone's achieved justice or overcome a barrier. So this is a really simple structure that you can use for like a 2-sentence social media post. You could also use it as the sort of overarching document structure of a submission, for a case study, short video, can be used in a range of ways, or I guess for like a campaign call out. Sorry, my attribution of this has dropped off, but this is from the Passing the Message SIP guide, where they write, every family needs healthcare to enjoy our lives to the full. Poorly funded and culturally insensitive health services run by outside experts have meant Aboriginal people have missed out on quality healthcare. Aboriginal run and controlled community health services work really well. With this approach, we're seeing much healthier Aboriginal people and communities. So you can see that kind of walk through from the value, villain, victory, and vision sort of structure. Recommendation 8 is to know your audience. This is just, I guess, about not doing one-size-fits-all messages. Think about who are you wanting to speak to, what language do they speak, where do they live, what are their attitudes and beliefs and values, what communications channels do they, does that community or do those people use, which messages are most trusted, like who can actually get this message across most effectively for you, and what design, visuals or colours might be best to engage this audience. So that's just about being, I suppose, specific in the way you use language. For example, if you wanted to attract funding from government for a new service for migrant workers in Western Sydney, we'd use really different communications than we would with maybe local organisations or community groups. And then I'll just point you to, at the end of the resource, there's a section called Words That Work, which gives you some common phrases that I picked up over my time working in the community legal sector, and just some reframing. So there again is the link, and at that link there's at that link there is a bunch of other resources, like on speaking about ageing or First Nations justice or drug law reform, or human rights. There's a bunch of other awesome resources out there that I encourage people to check out. So a bit of a whirlwind presentation. We've got 15 minutes. So if there are any questions, I'm happy to take them. And yeah.
Great, thanks so much, Stella. That was just fascinating, and I think it's taken us on a really good journey around, the way in which we can use language in more positive ways. So thank you very much for that. I'm mindful there is a little delay on the line, so if we have some silences, that's fine. It'll just kick in.
Are you there, Penny? I'm struggling to hear you.
Yeah. Can you hear me now, Stella? Okay, we might have a slight audio problem on the line. Can I just ask our audience, if you can hear me, could you pop your hands up in the chat? Just use your little hand again. Great, lots of hands going up there. Fantastic. So you can hear me. Stella, can you hear me now? We might have a bit of a sound problem for Stella, I think. So what we might need to do is actually take the questions on notice. I can see the participants there who've put questions up. Can you hear me now, Stella? There seems to be a bit of a problem there. So we might bring the webinar to a close. I'll do my best to make sure that we can get these questions answered by Stella and get responses back out to our participants who've asked them. I'm very sorry about that.
That sounds like a good plan. Sorry about the delay, everyone. I'm not sure.
We've got a little bit of a problem with it. Stella, can you hear me? No, it's not working. All right. So, look, thank you everyone for joining us today, and thank you so much for your time and expertise in sharing this resource with us, Stella. Just a reminder to please complete the feedback survey that'll pop up on your screen once the webinar's closed. And as I said, we'll do our best to try and get responses to the questions back for those people who've asked them. That's going to be it from us for now. Thank you very much for being part of it, and we hope to see you at our next webinar. Thanks so much, everyone.